Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Henry Hartevelt. I'm an airline industry analyst and president of Atmosphere Research Group, and it is my pleasure now to introduce Willie Walsh, the head of IATA, for our next session, and then we'll be going directly into a keynote panel with airline CEOs. Willie, welcome.
Thank you.
So, good idea. Let me take off my tag too. So, Willie, we've heard a lot this morning from Marianne, from David, from Joseph, about the state of the industry from their perspectives. Let's start with, how does IATA see things right now? You just had your sustainability event, was it a week or two ago?
Yep,
and you've got WPS, World Passenger Symposium, and World Financial Symposium coming up in a couple of weeks. So how do you see the state of the state?
Well, I think the positive is that demand for aviation remains strong. We're now well ahead of where we were in 2019. Globally, about 3.5% year to date. If I look to the end of August, about 3.5% ahead of where we were in 2019. Most parts of the world have exceeded their 2019 figure. The exception to that is international travel in the Asia-Pacific region. And that's principally a geopolitical issue, and it's principally around China and flights into China from the US and from Europe into China as a result of the closure of Russian airspace. So I think what's the positive is demand is good. The negative is geopolitics is definitely impacting on the industry a lot more today than it was 5-6 years ago.
It seems though that geopolitics always has an effect on it. But it's more intense right now. That makes operating more challenging for all airlines. Have you sensed that airlines have become more adaptive, more agile just in dealing with all of this turmoil?
I think you've got to give this industry credit. When you think of the crises we've gone through, and particularly the most recent one, I think it demonstrates both the resilience of the industry, but also the adaptability. Like the great example I use is how passenger airlines pivoted towards cargo during the pandemic. So very little demand for passenger traffic, principally because borders were closed. So it was a false environment we were operating in, but huge demand for cargo. So you ended up with passenger aircraft transporting cargo in the passenger cabin. Now, that was all done very, very quickly, and without that, I think we would have faced an even greater crisis through that pandemic period. So our industry has become much more flexible, much more adaptable, and I'm 45 years in the industry now, and the change that I've seen is, if I think back to when I started, there was this sense that we just ride through the cycles. You didn't do anything different, you just hung on in there during the downturn and waited for the upturn, and then celebrate, and then wait for the next downturn. That doesn't happen now. First sign of downturn, first sign of weakening demand, I see the industry immediately responding, taking measures to adapt to what is going to happen. And that's a big change that we've seen in quite a short period of time, and particularly since the global financial crisis in 2008. I think for me that was a significant period. The behaviors I witnessed post 2008 were very different to what I'd seen prior to that. So our industry is very resilient, and it is much more adaptable than we had been, if you like, in the early stages of my career.
I agree. Well, early stages of mine as well, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about sustainability.
Yeah.
We've heard some very interesting and very different opinions this morning about how airlines should be viewing our commitment to sustainability. I know that we take it seriously. I know IATA has set objectives for the industry to strive to achieve. So where are we with it? How did the sustainability event go? What takeaways surprised you from it? And how do you feel about the discussion that we're hearing? There is more discussion that questioning whether SAF is worth the investment. And should we be looking at other solutions, either in addition to or perhaps instead of SAF?
Well, I think what we're seeing is a realization on the part of the industry, but also on the part of those outside, that the transition to net zero is going to be very expensive. Now, I've been saying that for years. I think there are a lot of politicians around today, and have been for some time, who try to convince people that this is just going to be business as usual, and don't worry about it. Transitioning to net zero is just a thing that we'll do. That's not going to happen. It's going to be very complex. It's going to take time, it's going to take energy, and it's going to take a hell of a lot of money. So we recently published a study which estimated that it'll cost, the differential between the cost of SAF and the cost of traditional kerosene over the period between 2024 and 2050 is about $4.7 trillion US dollars. It would amount to about an average of $174 billion a year for the industry, if it was linear, and it won't be. It ramps up significantly towards the 2050 goal of net zero. So it's going to be very expensive. And that figure, I think, is frightening a lot of people, because what is clear is that there is no way the airline industry can function and deal with that figure on its own. So to put it into context, this year we estimate that the fuel bill would be approximately $291 billion US dollars. So if you increase that by 174 billion, 465 billion, it would mean fuel would represent 42% of the industry's cost base, which is way beyond anything we've experienced before. Now, the industry this year is forecast to make a net profit of 30 billion. So there's just no way the industry can absorb that cost. So when people say, well, who's going to pay for this? Well, it's absolutely clear. The consumer is going to pay. The consumer has to pay. Like any other product, if the costs go up, the price will go up. So, that is going to have an impact. And again, using very crude economics and crude maths, and I don't want people to run away and say, this is what it's going to cost. But if that 174 billion was added to the cost base today, and assuming the industry could recover that through increased fares, it would increase the average fare by about 17%. 1.7. And that's a huge figure.
It is a huge figure, because there are already people who are struggling just to pay the fares that we have today. And there are a lot of people who, because of the economic environment in certain countries, aren't able to travel at all, or as much as they would like.
And yet demand is higher than it's ever been.
Yes, but it's skewed towards,
it's demand is high right across the board. So people, have challenged about, well, what's this mean for business travel? And people often confuse premium travel with business travel, and the two are very different. So premium travel continues to grow, and actually it's growing faster than economy travel. And it's, as a percentage of total travel, it's slightly higher than it was in 2019. So this isn't just about, it's all going to be low-cost flying. It's impacting on everybody, and growth is happening right across the world. So, this transition is frightening. And I think that is causing people to stand back and say, how are we going to do this? Now, going to your question, there is no other option other than SAF at this stage. There's no other option. We talk about hydrogen. Hydrogen will play a role, but it's not going to play a role in the near term. The aircraft that are being ordered and delivered today will be flying in 25 years. No question about that. And the aircraft that will be delivered in 5 years' time will be flying 30 years from now. And the aircraft that are delivered 10 years from now. So there's no technological development in terms of aircraft design that is in the foreseeable future that is going to enable us to move away from a liquid fuel. Right. And therefore, if we're to meet the net zero target in 2050, we have to find an alternative fuel source, and the only one available today is SAF.
So what's the role of government here? I mean, in the U.S. we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and that the government has allocated funds for research and development of cleaner energy, including sustainable aviation fuel. You can argue whether it's enough, and that's fair. But other governments don't seem to be as supportive. What do we need to do to get other governments on board with this?
Well, I think the US is the model that I think is right. The idea, I contrast US and Europe. In the US, they've provided a framework that has incentivized investment in the production of sustainable aviation fuel. Now, it's time limited, but it's had a big impact. And therefore, when you look at it, nearly all of the SAF that's being used today and likely to be used in the near term is being produced in the US. Europe says you have to use SAF, big stick. And if you don't use SAF, we're going to add penalties. And all it's doing is driving up the cost for the industry. So France is the best example of this. There is a 1% blend requirement on SAF, on fuel providers in France. There's no SAF. They couldn't care less. They couldn't give a shit about it, because what they're saying is, I'm a monopoly supplier. You know, so you find me all you like. I'm just going to add it to the price of the fuel that I give to these poor suckers, the airlines, because they've no choice, and they're just going to have to pay the price that I charge them. So you're getting zero environmental benefit, and the penalties are just been passed through to the airlines, who are passing it on to the consumer because we have to. And people think that this is the right thing to do. It's total madness. If the challenge is net zero in 2050, and our industry is aligned with the global political environment, and it is pretty much global, that we have to get to net zero, you could argue over the time frame, then governments are going to have to play their part to incentivize the production of SAF in exactly the same way as they incentivize solar and wind. And we've estimated that the investment in solar and wind was actually greater than the investment that's required for SAF. About $5.2 trillion went towards the production of solar and wind energy over about a 20-year time frame. So, I think governments have to play their part. Governments, let's be clear, the governments through ICAO, and ICAO is a government body, it's a United Nations government body, agreed to a long-term aspirational goal of net zero in 2050. They have to play their part. And the part they have to play is to figure out how can they provide a framework that enables more people to invest in the production of SAF, because it is the only thing we have available, certainly in the short to medium term, before we get to new technologies like hydrogen. And the challenge with hydrogen is, for it to be effective, it's got to be green hydrogen. And we've a long way to go before we get to green hydrogen. But there is a pathway there, and hydrogen will play a part in the transition. But the single greatest contributor to our mitigation for 2050 is sustainable aviation fuel.
Willie, you have conversations with leadership, government leaders. Are they coming around? Do they understand that they have a role to play? Are they saying, yes, we're willing to do it, we just have to figure out how? Or are they saying, you know what, you guys figure it out, airlines, we don't care?
No, I think they're slowly getting it, and some are much more progressive than others. I look at Singapore. Singapore is very keen to decarbonize, and they're very active. But what they're saying is, we want to decarbonize and protect our economy. We don't want to do one at the expense of the other.
Right.
And I think you're seeing much more mature discussions in certain parts of the world, where they recognize that actually the dependence on aviation is huge. So I was in Morocco. We had a conference in Morocco last Tuesday and Wednesday. Tourism is about 12% of GDP in Morocco. In Marrakesh, where we had the conference, tourism is the economy. And you can't do that without aviation. So I think more and more they're recognizing that aviation is going to continue to play a critical part in their economic development. India is an example I give. India, you think of the demographics, the geographics of India, and what aviation is going to mean for their transition and the economic growth of that country. They have to depend on connectivity through aviation. They do not have a roll and rail alternative. So I think the debate in Europe, I find it quite artificial, really, in Europe, and to some degree quite arrogant, because we're, as Europeans, and I'm a proud European, but I think there is this sense of lecturing the rest of the world about what they need to do, based on what is possible in Europe. But it's not possible in other parts of the world. So, I think we have to have a much more mature discussion. I'm pleased to say that I think that is happening now. And I think more and more governments are recognizing that SAF actually represents a big opportunity for them. Because you now have an industry that can generate jobs, that can generate significant economic growth, and can help to decarbonize a critical industry as well.
Great. And the sun shines on us on that great note. So, Willie, I'm going to ask you to stay where you are because we're going to continue the conversation, but with our panel.